Edgar was what they called a forgotten soul. Old and almost helpless, he spent the last years of his life in the silence of a nursing home, where the days flowed monotonously, like a dirty stream. All he had left was an old closet in the corner of the room, which he brought from his home. This closet, covered in cobwebs and time, seemed to beckon him every time he looked at it. One night, when the moon was barely illuminating the room, Edgar heard a whisper. It was not the voice of a nurse or a neighbor, it was a voice from the closet. He got out of bed, feeling how his old joints protested at every movement. As he approached, he heard the voice become clearer. It was a call, something between a promise and a threat. Open up. Find yourself, a whisper came from behind the closet door. Edgar froze. His shaking hand reached for the handle. The cabinet had never opened before, even when he tried hard. But this time the door gave way easily, as if it was being held open for him. There was darkness inside, thick and ominous, but it beckoned to him. I'm going crazy, he whispered, but he stepped forward anyway. The darkness swallowed him, leaving only a soft rustling sound behind. When Edgar opened his eyes, he found himself not in the familiar room of the nursing home, but in a strange, unreal place. The ground around him was soft, almost fluffy. Trees like giant stuffed animals stretched toward the sky, which shimmered with strange shades of pink and purple. The air was thick as cotton candy, and smelled like childhood memories, mint, vanilla, and the dust of old books. Where am I? Edgar muttered, looking around. His voice sounded muffled, as if he was absorbed in this strange world. He felt his body become lighter, his movements freer. The years seemed to disappear, leaving him younger, stronger. But the joy quickly turned to alarm when he noticed that the world around him was beginning to move. The toy trees bent toward him as if in greeting, but their softness seemed deceptive. A figure appeared before him, a doll dressed in royal attire. She was majestic and frightening at the same time. Her glass eyes looked straight at him, and her lips, made of bright fabric, formed a strange smile. Welcome, Edgar, she said in a voice reminiscent of the sounds of a violin. You are in a world where dreams come true. But the price for this is always high. Edgar clenched his fists, trying not to show fear. Why am I here? He asked. I'm just an old man who wanted peace. The queen of the puppet world tilted her head, her movements sharp, like a puppet. You are no longer an old man. You are the chosen one. This world is your path to redemption or oblivion. Step forward and find your destiny. There was something hypnotic in her voice, and Edgar felt his feet move forward on their own until he stood on the edge of a soft cliff. There was fog behind him, and below him, something was moving, ready to swallow him. He knew there was no turning back. Edgar walked through the empty corridors of the castle, where every sound echoed off the soft walls, like a mockery of his presence. His feet sank into the carpet, reminiscent of the fur of a strange animal, and each step was accompanied by a creaking sound, as if the floor beneath him was trying to speak. But the most terrible thing was the eyes. Hundreds, thousands of eyes of toys. They looked at him from the shelves, from the darkness of corners, from the chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. These eyes were not dead. They watched. They moved. You are all just dolls. Edgar shouted to convince himself of his courage, but his voice sounded pathetic. No one answered. He continued to walk forward, feeling how the walls of the corridors began to narrow. Soon it became difficult for him to breathe, and his chest was squeezed, as if someone was pressing with great force. Here the corridor ended abruptly, and a large door appeared in front of him. Its surface was covered with drawings of people and toys in strange poses, either playing or fighting. A handle in the shape of a human hand looked at him like a challenge. When Edgar took hold of it, he felt the handle squeeze his fingers in response. The door swung open with a crash, and he found himself in a room where he was surrounded by mirrors. Each one reflected him, not as he was now, but as he had been at different periods of his life. He saw himself young and energetic, next to a beautiful woman whose face radiated happiness. He saw himself aged, as they sat together by the fireplace, holding each other's hands. But there were other reflections, more sinister. They showed him sitting alone, with empty eyes, surrounded by shadow. Choice. Is this about choice? He whispered, but all he heard in response was his own echo. These mirrors seemed to tease him, showing him what he had lost. What he could get back. But at what cost? Edgar reached out to one of the mirrors, where he had been happy and young, but when he touched it, he felt his hand sink into a cold, sticky substance. The mirror shook, its surface began to flow like liquid, and then he heard a voice. It was his voice, but at the same time, not his. You must prove yourself worthy, or you will stay here forever. Fear gripped him, but Edgar knew there was no turning back. He stepped forward, right into the trembling surface of the mirror. Stepping beyond the mirror, Edgar found himself in a huge hall, where the ceiling was lost in the haze, and the walls were strewn with shelves with hundreds of stuffed toys. But these toys were moving. They were laughing, whispering to each other, some were crying like real children. In the center of the hall stood a huge teddy bear. It was taller than a man, and its eyes, made of buttons, were boring into Edgar with a look. Do you think you are ready? The bear spoke in a low, growling voice. Its paws seemed to be able to crush a man with one blow. Edgar did not answer. He only clenched his fists, trying not to show his fear. Then the bear clapped his hands, and 3 figures came out of the shadows of the hall towards him. They were people, but not quite. Their movements were strange, broken, like puppets. Their faces, made of fabric, were unnaturally smooth, and their eyes shone with emptiness. You must choose one. One will help you, the others will lead to your end. Make a choice. Edgar peered at the figures, trying to figure out which of them was a true ally. One of them, a tall man with long arms and a hunched back, looked the friendliest. His smile was warm, but too perfect. The second figure, a woman with short, doll-like hair, was whispering something under her breath, looking at the floor. The third, a short man with eyes like lanterns, simply looked at Edgar. His gaze was empty and piercing, as if he could see everything the old man was thinking. Edgar hesitated. Sweat trickled down his temples, his breathing quickened. You. He pointed at the man with the lantern eyes. You will lead me. The man nodded slowly, holding out his hand, cold as ice. We'll see what happens, the bear muttered, his grin widening. The floor beneath Edgar's feet began to crumble. Everything around him spun, and the old man and his mysterious companion fell into obscurity, leaving behind only the whispers of the soft toys' mocking laughter. Edgar opened his eyes and found himself in a strange place, an endless labyrinth with soft walls decorated with patterns of eyes. Every corner seemed the same, each turn only led him deeper into chaos. There is no way out, he whispered, his voice echoing through the corridors. His companion walked forward silently, confidently choosing a path, as if he knew exactly where to go. Edgar tried to keep up, but every movement was difficult for him. Suddenly, the walls began to move, as if they had a life of their own. One of the patterns of eyes blinked, and then again and again. "Do you feel it, Edgar?" the bear's voice echoed, filling the space. "Every corner of this labyrinth is your fault. You must choose. Will you hide or face the truth?" Edgar froze. He felt the walls pressing in on him, the air growing thicker. "What the hell kind of game are you playing?" he shouted. But there was no answer. Only a dull echo of his own voice. Finally, the maze ended. Edgar found himself in a huge room filled with light. In the center stood a table with a single object on it, a photograph. He came closer and froze. It was himself, but in his youth, together with his late wife. "Are you still clinging to this, Edgar?" the bear's voice rang out, but now it sounded inside his head. "She was all I had," Edgar muttered. His eyes filled with tears. The photograph suddenly came to life. He saw him and his wife laughing, dancing. But after a moment, the image began to change. He saw himself alone, sitting by her bed as she left. Then he saw himself now, broken, alone. "You lost her. You lost everything," the bear's voice grew harsher. "No," Edgar screamed, grabbing the photograph. But it crumbled to dust. Everything was gone. Edgar found himself back in his room at the nursing home. The closet was closed, just like before. His breathing was heavy, and his body was weak. But he felt strangely light, as if the weight of the past had left him. Was it all a dream? He muttered. But when he looked at the closet, he noticed a doll's paw sticking out from under the door. Edgar moved closer. He wanted to open the closet, but this time his hands refused to obey. A familiar laugh rang out in his head. "Your journey has only just begun, Edgar," the bear's voice whispered. Darkness swallowed his mind. And no one ever saw Edgar again, neither in this world nor in the next.
"So, Mr. Lowe," the young journalist began, switching on his recorder, "you claim to have experienced something truly extraordinary." "Yes," Daniel nodded, his eyes reflecting deep fatigue. "It was beyond comprehension." "Please, start from the beginning," the journalist urged, leaning in. "It all began with my passion for photography," Daniel started, his voice trembling with the weight of recollection. "I always sought beauty in the most unexpected places. Abandoned buildings, wild forests, deserted streets. One day, while shooting in a forest outside the city, I stumbled upon an old house. It looked as if nature had reclaimed it. A sagging facade, windows like blind eyes, and a doll." "A doll?" the journalist echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," Daniel confirmed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A small, dusty doll lying by the doorstep. Something about it drew me in. I took it with me." "And what happened next?" the journalist inquired, a chill creeping down his spine. "That's when the oddities began," Daniel continued, his hands nervously fidgeting with the edge of the table. "Cameras left on overnight captured movement in empty rooms. At night, I heard whispers as if someone was calling my name, and then the doll started moving on its own." "This sounds like a scene from a horror movie," the journalist remarked, attempting to mask his skepticism. "I thought the same." Daniel sighed. "I decided to return it to the forest. But the forest, it had changed. Paths vanished, trees seemed to reach out to hold me back, and in the shadows I saw figures, small, like doll-sized shadows." "And did you manage to return the doll?" the journalist asked, leaning forward. "No," Daniel shook his head. "I couldn't find the spot where I found it. The forest wouldn't let me go. In a panic, I ran and found myself in an abandoned subway." "A subway? How did you end up there?" The journalist was taken aback. "I have no idea," Daniel admitted, his voice quivering. "The tunnels were empty, but I felt eyes watching me. Then I saw them. Hundreds of dolls scattered on the tracks, sitting on benches, standing in wall niches. Their eyes, they glowed in the dark. "This is unbelievable," the journalist whispered, unable to look away from Daniel. "I thought so too." Daniel let out a bitter chuckle. Until one of the dolls spoke. It said, "You took her. Now you're one of us." "What did you do?" The journalist's heart raced. "I ran." Daniel's eyes widened with the memory, but the tunnels turned into a maze. My flashlight flickered, shadows morphed into monsters. Then I found myself in a hall, surrounded by dolls, as they pulled me toward a dollhouse, inside of which was my apartment. "Your apartment?" the journalist repeated, disbelief evident. "Yes," Daniel nodded, and inside was that same doll. It said, "You will never leave us." Then I woke up here. "This is an astounding story, Mr. Lowe," the journalist said, turning off the recorder. "But you understand it's hard to believe?" "I know," Daniel sighed, his eyes dimming. "But sometimes reality is scarier than any fiction." The journalist stood, shaking Daniel's hand. "Thank you for sharing. I'll do my best to tell your story accurately. Be careful." Daniel's voice was barely audible. "Some stories are better left untold." The journalist nodded and left the room, leaving Daniel alone with his memories. "Some doors are best left unopened," Daniel whispered into the void, "and some dolls are best left untouched."
So, you're telling me that all of this actually happened? The young journalist, Daniel, leaned slightly over his cup of cold coffee, his gaze tense yet curious. "You were the one who wanted to hear the story," Leo Martinez smiled tiredly, resting against the dark wooden table. "And I'm telling it. But, believe me, it's not for the faint-hearted. You see how I live, don't you? This house, it's not just a place. It's a cage. Why didn't you leave? Why did you stay?" Daniel nervously adjusted his glasses. Leo frowned, exhaled, and began his story. "I grew up in Chicago. A noisy city where it's hard to hear your own thoughts. My father was a mysterious man. He rarely talked about himself, and even less about his past. My mom died when I was a kid. After that, he started drifting away. And then, he disappeared. I searched for him. Years went by in vain attempts to find answers. The only thing left to me was a small inheritance from some distant relative. Then I decided, enough. I wanted peace. That's how I found this house. In photos, it looked cozy. Funny, right? But when I arrived, I immediately felt something was off. It was like the air here was different. Heavy, sticky. But I chalked it up to fatigue and memories. So, Leo chuckled, the first days were strange. The house was cold, the walls seemed to breathe. You ever heard how an old house can make noises, like it's alive? Of course, nodded Daniel. But you, felt something? Not right away, Leo lifted his gaze. The first couple of nights, I'd wake up feeling like someone was watching me. But that wasn't all. On rainy nights, the sound of droplets turned into footsteps. I thought I was losing my mind. But on the third night, I heard knocking in the hallway. What did you do? I shouted, who's there? Leo smirked slightly. The only answer was silence. But that silence, it was too loud, you know? Like the darkness itself was laughing at me. The next day, I decided to explore the house. Just to make sure it was only creaky floors and wind. But under the carpet in the living room, I found a hatch. You ever seen hatches that seem to hide on purpose? That's odd, Daniel muttered. More than odd, Leo nodded. The lock was jammed, but I broke it. Below was a staircase leading to a basement. When I went down, the air there, it was thick, like tar. And in the room itself, a portrait. What kind of portrait? A man. His face looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. And you know what's the strangest thing? Leo stared intently at his companion. In the portrait, his eyes were looking right at me. After that, the real madness began. One night, I found the portrait by my bed. I hadn't moved it. You'd think it was a hallucination, but... Leo paused for a moment, then added, I heard it being moved. The creak of the floorboards was loud, like a scream. Daniel frowned, but didn't interrupt. Then there were shadows. Have you ever noticed how light plays on walls? Well, in my house, it didn't play. The shadows moved on their own. The voice came on the fourth night. It was raspy but familiar. It called me by name. Leo, why are you here? I froze. It was my father's voice. Are you sure? Absolutely. I tried to answer, but no sound came out of my throat. And you know what he said next? You thought you could hide? The truth always finds you. In the morning, I went back to the basement. The portrait had changed. The face on it looked more like my father's. I started digging through the books and notes I found there. They were about rituals, about souls bound to houses. Daniel silently jotted down every word. I realized that this house, it's like a trap. Souls that enter here never leave. That night, it got even worse. The voice screamed, "Finish what I started." The light went out, and I felt a touch. It was cold, like death itself. I screamed and ran out of the room. What did you do next? Daniel asked. Tried to escape. But the doors wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. And then the voice said, "The house is you." I realized there was no way out. Daniel put away his notebook, but his hands were trembling. And how do you? I don't live. I exist. Leo stood up, and Daniel noticed how his silhouette merged with the shadows of the room. This house is now your cage too. The room dimmed, and the last thing Daniel heard was a whisper, "Welcome."
Part 1. A Chance to Escape. You know, Anya said, swirling the wine in her glass as she gazed out at the lake. I always thought solitude would be peaceful, but this place, it's unsettling. Unsettling? Sophie's voice crackled through the speakerphone. You've been there for 2 days, and already you're spooked? It's a rental, not a haunted mansion. Anya sighed. It's not the house. It's the silence. It's too much. After her divorce, Anya had jumped at the chance to escape the city. A quaint lakeside cabin seemed perfect, a way to disconnect and rediscover herself. But the isolation was heavier than she anticipated, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Part 2. The Unseen Visitor. The first night was restless. Every creak of the wooden floor, every rustle outside, jolted her awake. The second night, it was worse. As she was closing the blinds, a strange light in the distance caught her eye. It hovered above the tree lean, pulsing faintly. Anya's heart raced as she watched it disappear, only to reappear moments later, closer this time. Probably a drone, she muttered, trying to convince herself. But drones didn't emit that low, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Part 3. Into the Unknown. Curiosity, or perhaps foolishness, got the better of her. Armed with a flashlight and her grandfather's old hunting knife, she ventured into the forest. The air was thick, heavy with an electric charge that made her skin prickle. The light was ahead, growing brighter, pulling her deeper into the woods. What she found was beyond comprehension, a sleek, metallic craft hovering inches above the ground. It pulsed with an otherworldly glow, its surface shifting like liquid metal. Before she could process what she was seeing, a figure emerged. It was tall and slender, its eyes large and black, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. Anya froze. The figure raised a hand, or what she assumed was a hand, and in her mind, she heard a voice. You are not alone. Part 4. A Night to Forget. Anya woke up in her bed, drenched in sweat. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the familiar surroundings of the guest room. For a brief, blissful moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But then she noticed the small, triangular mark on the inside of her wrist, 3 tiny dots arranged in a perfect triangle. Her stomach churned as the memories of the previous night came flooding back. The light, the figure, the voice, it had all been real. She stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, trying to calm her racing thoughts. As she stared at her reflection in the mirror, she noticed something else. Her eyes, usually a soft hazel, now had a faint, metallic sheen to them. Panic surged through her as she tried to rationalize what was happening. Part 5. The Awakening. The sound of her phone ringing jolted her out of her thoughts. She ran back to the bedroom and grabbed it, relief flooding her when she saw Sophie's name on the screen. Sophie. Thank God. Anya cried, her voice trembling. Something happened last night. I don't know how to explain it, but... Anya, Sophie interrupted, her tone unusually serious. You need to get out of there. Right now. What? Why? What's going on? I don't have time to explain, but I did some digging after you called. That area where you're staying, there have been reports. Strange sightings, disappearances. People who've gone there and never come back. Anya's blood ran cold. What do you mean? What kind of reports? Just get out, Anya. Please. I'll meet you at my place. We'll figure this out together. The line went dead. Anya stared at the phone, her mind racing. Sophie's urgency only added to her growing sense of dread. She packed her belongings in record time, throwing everything into her duffel bag without care. As she stepped out onto the porch, she glanced back at the forest one last time. The clearing where the craft had been was empty, but the memory of it burned vividly in her mind. She got into her car and sped down the gravel driveway, her heart pounding with every mile that put distance between her and the house. But even as the countryside blurred past her window, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Epilogue: The mark left behind. Anya never returned to the cabin. At Sophie's insistence, she underwent every test and scan imaginable. But doctors found nothing unusual, except for the triangular mark on her wrist, which they dismissed as a minor skin irritation. Weeks turned into months, and Anya tried to move on. But the memories lingered, vivid and unrelenting. She couldn't forget the figure, the voice, the way it spoke to her without words. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she noticed the mark on her wrist glowing faintly. Her heart raced as she stared at it, a single thought echoing in her mind: you are not alone. The hum returned, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Anya stood frozen, staring out the window as a light appeared in the distance, pulsing softly. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun.